Dragged shy cashier to bathroom, unaware 50 Hell's Angels were watching. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as Grace Mitchell straightened the candy display near the register. Her fingers moved methodically, organizing the colorful wrappers into neat rows. The store was quiet except for the gentle whir of the refrigerator units along the back wall. A bell chimed as the front door opened. Mrs. Henderson, a regular customer in her 70s, shuffled in with her worn canvas shopping bag. Grace offered her a small smile, the kind that didn't draw too much attention, but showed she recognized the elderly woman. "Evening, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, making her way to the dairy section. Grace nodded politely, but didn't engage further. She'd learned over her 2 years working here that most customers preferred minimal interaction, and that suited her just fine. Her hands moved to reorganize the impulse items near the register: lip balm, lighters, and small packets of aspirin. The evening crawled by slowly. A teenager came in for an energy drink, barely glancing her way as he tossed exact change on the counter. A couple stopped for gas and picked up some snacks, talking to each other the whole time, as if Grace were invisible. She rang up their purchases efficiently, speaking only to tell them the total. Through the store's large front windows, Grace watched as the sky turned a deeper shade of blue. A few cars passed by on the quiet street, their headlights briefly illuminating the interior of the store. The familiar sight reminded her of countless other evenings spent in this same spot, watching life happen around her while she remained safely in her bubble. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. A rush of cold air swept in as a group of college students burst through the door, laughing and talking loudly about a party they were heading to. Grace instinctively drew back slightly, making herself smaller behind the counter. They grabbed chips and dip, weaving through the aisles with the casual confidence of youth. "That'll be $27.50, Grace said softly when they approached the counter. The tallest boy slapped down some crumpled bills, still engaged in conversation with his friends. They left in a whirlwind of energy and noise, leaving behind a silence that felt almost heavy in comparison. Grace glanced at her watch. 8:45 p.m. Only 15 minutes left in her shift. Her shoulders slumped slightly as she thought about her mother at home. The caregiver would be leaving soon, and her mom always got confused in the evenings. The familiar weight of responsibility settled over her as she considered what to make for dinner. The store's shelves held plenty of options, but Grace knew she needed to be careful with their limited budget. Her mother's medical bills took most of her paycheck, leaving little room for extras. She eyed the markdown section where day-old bread and nearly expired items offered the best deals. A middle-aged man in a business suit came in for cigarettes, barely looking up from his phone as she rang up his purchase. Grace noticed his expensive watch and crisp collar, wondering what it would be like to have such certainty in one's place in the world. The minutes ticked by slowly. Grace began her closing routine, counting the money in the register, making sure the coffee station was clean, and checking that the coolers were properly stocked for the morning shift. Each task was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. As the clock approached 9, Grace's thoughts drifted to the grocery list in her pocket. She knew the items by heart: bread, eggs, soup, and her mother's favorite tea. Maybe there would be some marked-down vegetables she could add to stretch their meals further. Through the office window, Grace could see David pacing back and forth, his shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. Every few minutes, he would stop to check something on his clipboard, his face pinched with displeasure. Grace tried to focus on restocking the shelves, but she could feel his eyes on her whenever he glanced out. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across David's face as he emerged from his office for the third time that hour. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching as Grace arranged bottles of soda in the cooler. His presence made her hand shake slightly, causing one of the bottles to slip. She caught it before it fell, but not before David clicked his tongue in disapproval. "Careful with the merchandise, Mitchell," he said, his voice sharp. "We can't afford waste." Grace nodded silently, carefully placing the bottle in its spot. She'd been covering extra shifts all week for Jenny, who was home with the flu. The extra hours meant more money for her mother's care, but they also meant more time under David's scrutiny. As the afternoon wore on, David found more reasons to hover. He pointed out dust on the top shelves, questioned her organization of the magazine rack, and made notes on his clipboard with aggressive scratches of his pen. Grace kept her head down and continued working, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. "The coffee station needs attention," David announced loudly enough for the few customers in the store to hear. Grace hurried over, though she'd cleaned it thoroughly just an hour ago. She wiped down the already spotless counter while David watched, his foot tapping impatiently. The day dragged on, marked by David's constant critiques. When Grace took her lunch break, she could see him through the break room window, reorganizing displays she'd just finished. She barely touched her sandwich, her appetite diminished by the tension. Near the end of her shift, while Grace was counting her register, David appeared beside her. His cologne was overwhelming in the small space, and she had to resist the urge to step back. "Mitchell," he said, his voice clipped. "My office, after your shift." Grace's hands trembled as she counted the last stack of ones. "Yes, sir. Is there a problem?" David's eyes narrowed. "Several, actually. You've been slacking on basic responsibilities. The store's standards are slipping under your watch." "I'm sorry," Grace said quietly. "I've been trying to keep up with everything while covering for Jenny." "That's not an excuse," David cut her off. "If anything, you should be working harder to prove yourself worthy of the extra hours." He gestured to a small spill near the coffee station that must have happened moments ago. "Case in point. Sloppy work, Mitchell. Very sloppy." Grace nodded, her chest tight. She'd been working doubles, sacrificing her breaks to keep the store running smoothly. But looking at David's stern face, she knew none of that mattered. "After your shift," he repeated, turning toward his office. "Don't make me wait." The remaining minutes of her shift ticked by with excruciating slowness. Grace completed her closing duties with extra care, knowing David was watching for any mistake. When the clock finally showed 9, she took a deep breath and walked toward the back office, her footsteps heavy with dread. Grace's footsteps echoed in the empty corridor as she followed David toward the back of the store. The hallway seemed longer than usual, stretching endlessly under the dim fluorescent lights that flickered overhead. Her heart beat faster with each step, though she tried to convince herself this was just another routine meeting. "Sir?" she ventured quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What exactly did I do wrong?" David didn't answer. His shoulders were tense, his movements stiff as he walked ahead of her. The sound of his heavy breathing filled the narrow space. Grace noticed his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, his knuckles white with tension. The storage room doors passed by on either side. First inventory, then the break room, then supplies. But David didn't stop at any of them. Instead, he continued toward the very back of the store, where the hallway ended at the employee bathroom. Something wasn't right. Grace's chest tightened as uncertainty gave way to fear. This wasn't the way to his office at all. "I really should be getting home," Grace said, her voice trembling. "My mother needs—" David spun around so quickly that Grace stumbled backward. His face was red, contorted with anger she'd never seen before. "Your mother? Is that your excuse for everything?" He grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging into her skin. I'm sick of your excuses." Grace tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. "Please, you're hurting me," she gasped. "Hurting you?" David's laugh was harsh and cold. "You want to know what hurts? Having an employee who can't follow simple instructions, who thinks she can slack off just because she has family problems." He yanked her forward, dragging her toward him, the bathroom door. The fluorescent light above them buzzed and flickered, casting strange shadows across David's face. Grace's heart hammered in her chest as panic set in. This couldn't be happening. The quiet convenience store she'd worked in for 2 years suddenly felt like a trap. "I'll do better," Grace promised, her voice shaking. "Whatever I did wrong, I'll fix it." "Oh, you'll learn your lesson all right," David snarled, reaching for the bathroom door handle. "I'm going to teach you exactly what happens to employees who don't appreciate their jobs." The bathroom door creaked open, and Grace felt tears welling in her eyes. But before David could push her inside, a deep rumble filled the store, the sound of dozens of motorcycles pulling up outside. The front door chimes rang out, not with their usual gentle tinkle, but with the force of the door being thrown open. Heavy boots thundered against the floor, and David's head snapped up at the sound. "What the hell?" David muttered, his grip on Grace's arm loosening slightly. A shadow fell across the hallway. No, not one shadow, but many. The thundering footsteps grew louder, and suddenly, the corridor was filled with the imposing presence of 50 Hell's Angels. Their leather vests creaked as they moved, patches and pins glinting under the fluorescent lights. At their head stood DeMarco, his massive frame nearly touching the ceiling. His tattooed arms were crossed over his chest, and his eyes locked onto David's hand gripping Grace's arm. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop several degrees. When DeMarco spoke, his voice was like rolling thunder. "Take your hands off her. Now." David's fingers went slack, and he released Grace's arm as if he'd been burned. He stumbled backward, his face draining of all color as he stared up at the wall of leather-clad bikers blocking the hallway. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across DeMarco's face as he took another step forward. David pressed himself against the bathroom door, trying to make himself smaller. The narrow hallway seemed to shrink even further with the presence of so many large men, their leather vests creaking as they shifted to form a protective barrier around Grace. Grace's heart was still racing, but the fear from moments ago began to transform into something else. The Hell's Angels, despite their intimidating appearance, radiated a warmth she hadn't expected. Their eyes, though hard when looking at David, softened when they glanced her way. "You okay, miss?" one of them asked quietly. His voice was gentle, a stark contrast to his towering frame and the skull tattoo on his neck. Grace nodded, unable to find her voice. Her arm still tingled where David had grabbed her, and she absently rubbed the spot. DeMarco noticed the gesture, his jaw tightening as he turned back to David. "Let me make something very clear," DeMarco said, his voice low and controlled. Each word carried the weight of a promise. "We've been watching. We've seen how you treat your employees, especially Grace here." He took another step closer to David, who pressed himself even harder against the door. "It stops now." The other angels shifted, their leather and chains creating a symphony of quiet menace. Some cracked their knuckles, while others simply stared at David with unwavering intensity. The message was clear. They were united in their protection of Grace. I was just..." David's voice cracked as he tried to explain. His earlier bravado had evaporated completely, leaving behind a trembling shell of a man. "It was a misunderstanding. I would never..." "Save it!" DeMarco cut him off. His massive hand rose, silencing David mid-sentence. "We don't want to hear your excuses. What we want is your word that this will never happen again." He paused, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. "Because if it does, if you so much as look at Grace the wrong way, we'll be back. And next time we won't be so polite about it." Grace watched as David nodded frantically, his face pale and sweaty. "Yes, yes, of course, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," he stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush. But his eyes darted everywhere except at Grace, making it clear his apology was born of fear rather than genuine remorse. DeMarco turned to Grace, and his expression softened considerably. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said quietly, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so imposing. "We look after our own in this town." The angels began to file out of the hallway, their boots thundering against the floor. Each one nodded respectfully to Grace as they passed, some offering small smiles of encouragement. The contrast between their fierce appearance and their protective nature left Grace speechless, rooted to the spot as she tried to process everything that had just happened. David remained pressed against the bathroom door, mumbling apologies that grew increasingly desperate as the angels departed. His hands shook as he straightened his tie, trying to regain some semblance of dignity, but his eyes remained wide with fear. The last angel to leave was DeMarco, who paused at the end of the hallway. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. His presence alone, and the promise of their return if needed, spoke volumes. David's trembling form and continued stream of hollow apologies proved the message had been received, even if his contrition wasn't sincere. Grace's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. The rumble of motorcycle engines filled the parking lot, then gradually faded into the distance. The sudden silence in the store felt heavy, almost suffocating, broken only by the quiet hum of the refrigerators and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. She could still feel the lingering presence of the Hell's Angels, their unexpected protection like a warm blanket around her shoulders. The memory of DeMarco's commanding voice echoed in her mind, so different from the cruel tone David had used just minutes before. Her arm still held a ghost of David's rough grip, but somehow it didn't seem as important anymore. Through the store's large front windows, she watched the last of the motorcycles disappear around the corner, their taillights glowing like red fireflies in the growing dusk. Each angel had looked at her before leaving, their eyes conveying a silent promise of protection. It was strange how safe she felt under those gazes, despite their intimidating appearances. David hadn't emerged from the back office since scurrying away. The sound of his door closing had been followed by complete silence. Grace knew she should feel worried about tomorrow, about facing him again. But something had changed inside her. The fear that had been her constant companion during work hours seemed to have loosened its grip. She gathered her belongings from behind the counter with mechanical movements, her mind still processing the events of the evening. Her small purse, the worn paperback she never got to read during her break, her lunch container with the half-eaten sandwich. Everything seemed somehow different now, as if she was seeing these everyday items through new eyes. The clock on the wall showed it was time to leave. Grace pulled on her light jacket, checking twice to make sure everything was in order before heading to the door. The bell chimed as she stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against her cheeks. The parking lot was nearly empty now, save for her old Honda Civic and David's car hidden around the back of the building. As she walked to her car, each step felt different. The same cracked asphalt she'd crossed hundreds of times before suddenly seemed to hold new meaning. She'd always been invisible here, just another person going through the motions of life. But tonight, complete strangers had seen her, really seen her, and decided she was worth protecting. Grace reached her car and paused, keys in hand. The weight of what had happened finally settled fully on her shoulders. These men, who most people crossed the street to avoid, had stood up for her when no one else would. They'd shown her more kindness in one evening than she'd experienced in years of working at the store. She leaned against her car, overwhelmed by the realization that she wasn't as alone as she'd always thought. The cool metal against her back anchored her as emotions washed over her. Gratitude, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite name. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt truly cared for, truly seen. Looking back at the store, its familiar outline backlit by the setting sun, Grace suddenly saw it differently. The building that had been her whole world for so long now seemed smaller somehow, less defining. She'd always thought this was all there was for her, working, caring for her mother, existing day to day. But now, standing in the growing darkness of the parking lot, she wondered if maybe there was more to life than she'd allowed herself to imagine. The automatic doors slid open with their familiar whoosh as Grace rang up another customer's purchases. The morning sun streamed through the store's windows, casting long shadows across the aisles. Everything felt oddly normal, as if last night's events had been nothing more than a vivid dream. David hadn't shown up for his morning shift. The district manager had called to say he was taking some time off to reflect on recent events. Grace wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or anxious about his absence. She methodically restocked the shelves, straightened the magazine rack, and helped elderly Mrs. Peterson find her favorite brand of tea. The routine tasks kept her hands busy, but her mind kept drifting back to the previous night. The terror of David's grip, the thunderous arrival of the Hell's Angels, and DeMarco's commanding presence. The afternoon crawled by, marked only by the steady ticking of the wall clock and the occasional ding of the cash register. Grace checked her watch, just 15 minutes until her shift ended. She began her closing routine, counting the money in her drawer and organizing receipts. The sound of a motorcycle engine cut through the quiet store atmosphere. Grace's heart skipped a beat as she looked up, half expecting to see the entire gang again. Instead, a single rider dismounted from his bike. Even from inside, she could tell he was tall, very tall. The automatic doors parted, and Jackson stepped inside. His massive frame seemed to fill the entire entrance, leather vest adorned with the Hell's Angels patches, arms covered in intricate tattoos. But his face wore a warm smile that reached his eyes, somehow making him less intimidating despite his size. "Hey there, Grace," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for such a large man. "Hope you're doing better today?" Grace nodded, managing a small smile. "I am, thank you. And thank you all for last night." Jackson approached the counter, his movements careful and deliberate, as if trying not to startle her. "No need to thank us. We've been coming here long enough to know you're one of the good ones. Nobody deserves to be treated like that." He leaned against the counter, but not in an imposing way. Instead, his posture was relaxed, almost casual. "Actually, that's partly why I'm here. We've got this thing coming up, a charity event for kids in need. We do it every year." Grace blinked in surprise. The image of tough bikers organizing a children's charity event seemed almost surreal. "We could really use someone like you to help out," Jackson continued. "Someone organized, good with people, someone who cares." Grace felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected praise. I don't know," she stammered. "I'm not sure I'd be much help. I'm not very good with crowds or being around lots of people." Jackson's smile widened encouragingly. "That's what you think, but we've seen differently. The way you handle difficult customers, how you always remember the regulars' names, how you slip extra napkins to the homeless guy who comes in for coffee." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You've got a gift for making people feel seen, Grace. We could use that at the event." Grace fidgeted with her name tag. uncertainty written across her face. The idea of stepping into such an unfamiliar situation made her stomach flutter with anxiety. "I've never done anything like that before," she admitted quietly. "Sometimes the best things in life happen when we step outside our comfort zone," Jackson said kindly. "Just think about it, okay? The event's this weekend at the community center. No pressure, but we'd love to have you there." Grace sat at her small kitchen table, stirring her coffee absently while watching the morning sun filter through her worn curtains. The invitation from Jackson played over and over in her mind, like a stuck record. Her mother shuffled into the kitchen, still in her nightgown. "Good morning, sweetie," she said, her voice clear and present. "One of her good days." Grace smiled, grateful for these lucid moments. "Morning, Mom. Would you like some toast?" As Grace prepared breakfast for her mother, she couldn't help but think about the charity event. The thought of being surrounded by leather-clad bikers made her pulse quicken with anxiety. Yet something about Jackson's gentle demeanor and kind words had struck a chord. "You're quiet this morning," her mother observed, taking small bites of her toast. "Something on your mind?" Grace hesitated, then told her mother about Jackson's invitation. Her mother listened intently, a knowing look in her eyes. "You know," her mother said, "before I got sick, I used to volunteer at the library's reading program. I was terrified at first, speaking in front of all those children. But it turned out to be the highlight of my week." Grace reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. These moments of clarity were becoming increasingly rare, making them all the more precious. Throughout her shift at the store that day, Grace found herself watching the customers differently. She noticed how Mrs. Chen always bought the same brand of green tea, how Tommy from the auto shop carried a photo of his daughter in his wallet, how the college student who came in for energy drinks always looked exhausted but managed to smile. Jackson was right. She did notice these things. Maybe she wasn't as invisible as she felt. During her lunch break, Grace sat in her car and made a pros and cons list on the back of an old receipt. The cons were easy: crowds, noise, uncertainty, the possibility of embarrassing herself. But the pros kept growing, helping others, proving to herself she could do more, showing gratitude to the people who had stood up for her. That evening, after helping her mother into bed, Grace stood in front of her bathroom mirror. The reflection showed a woman she'd grown comfortable with, quiet, reliable, unremarkable. But beneath that familiar image, she could feel something stirring, a whisper of possibility. She thought about DeMarco's protective presence, Jackson's genuine belief in her abilities, and the way the entire gang had come to her defense. They had seen something in her that she struggled to see in herself. Taking a deep breath, Grace reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed the number Jackson had left her. "Hello?" His friendly voice answered after 2 rings. "Hi, Jackson. It's Grace, from the store." She paused, gathering her courage. "I've been thinking about the charity event." "Yeah." She could hear the smile in his voice. "I'd like to help. Maybe with the donation booth? Something quiet in the background?" The words tumbled out quickly before she could change her mind. "That's great, Grace. We'd love to have you there." Jackson's enthusiasm was genuine and warming. After hanging up, Grace sat on the edge of her bed, her heart racing but not entirely from fear. She would stick to the background, stay quiet, and do what she did best: observe and help from the sidelines. It felt like a safe compromise between her comfort zone and this unexpected new territory. She set her alarm for the morning, already planning to wear her most inconspicuous outfit to the event. If she was going to do this, she would do it her way, quietly, carefully, and without drawing attention to herself. Grace's hands trembled as she parked her old Honda Civic in front of the community center. The parking lot was filled with gleaming motorcycles lined up in neat rows, their chrome catching the morning sun. She sat for a moment, watching volunteers carry boxes and supplies through the double doors. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her purse and stepped out of her car. The sound of laughter and friendly chatter drifted from the building. As she approached the entrance, 2 Hells Angels members held the doors open for her, greeting her with warm smiles that seemed out of place on their tattooed faces. Inside, the community center had been transformed. Colorful banners hung from the ceiling, and tables were arranged in neat rows. The smell of coffee and fresh-baked cookies filled the air. Members of the motorcycle gang, still in their leather vests, worked alongside elderly ladies from the church group and teenagers from the local high school. Grace hugged her arms around herself, feeling small in the bustling space. A group of bikers were setting up a face-painting station, their rough hands carefully arranging bottles of bright paint. Near the stage, several women sorted through boxes of donated toys, while others hung streamers and balloons. "Grace, you made it!" Jackson's voice boomed across the room. He waved from where he was helping to set up folding chairs, his massive frame making the chairs look like children's furniture in his hands. She managed a small wave back, her feet feeling rooted to the spot. The activity around her was overwhelming, so different from the quiet routine of her convenience store shifts. "Hey there." A deep voice beside her made her jump. DeMarco stood there, his presence commanding yet somehow gentle. His dark eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Glad you could join us." Grace nodded, trying to find her voice. "Thank you for having me," she said softly. DeMarco's expression softened. He gestured toward a booth near the entrance, where a sign read, "Donations Welcome." "Jackson mentioned you might be good at handling the donation station. We need someone organized and good with people." "Oh, I don't know if I'm—" Grace started to protest, but DeMarco raised a hand. "You've got this," he said simply, giving her an encouraging nod. "Sarah over there will show you the ropes." Sarah turned out to be a grandmother of 3 who wore a leather vest over her floral dress. She walked Grace through the donation process, showing her where to record contributions and how to write receipts. "Most folks just want to know their money's going to help the kids," Sarah explained, her voice warm and patient. "You've got such a kind face. They'll trust you right away." As the first donors began to arrive, Grace found herself falling into an easy rhythm. She thanked each person, carefully recording their contributions and answering questions about the children's programs the money would support. To her surprise, she discovered she enjoyed listening to people's stories about why they chose to donate. An elderly man told her about his own childhood in foster care. A young couple shared how they'd been helped by a similar program years ago. Each interaction left Grace feeling more connected to her community than she had in years. From across the room, she caught DeMarco watching her. He gave her another nod, this one filled with quiet approval. Grace felt something shift inside her, a small spark of confidence beginning to grow. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson stood across the donation table from Grace, carefully unfolding a beautiful hand-knitted sweater from a cardboard box. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and kind wrinkles framed her gentle blue eyes. "My Harold used to wear this," Mrs. Thompson said, smoothing the soft wool with weathered hands. "He passed 3 years ago, but I just couldn't part with his things until now." She gave Grace a small, sad smile. Sometimes holding on hurts more than letting go. Grace's heart squeezed with understanding. She thought of her mother's good days becoming fewer, of precious memories slipping away like water through fingers. "I know what you mean," she said softly. "My mother, she has Alzheimer's. Sometimes I feel like I'm losing her piece by piece." Mrs. Thompson reached across the table and patted Grace's hand. "Oh dear, that's such a difficult journey. My sister had it too." She began pulling out more clothes from her box. Shirts, jackets, all carefully folded. "You know what helped me. Finding ways to give back to others. It doesn't fix things, but it helps heal the heart." Grace nodded, carefully recording each item Mrs. Thompson donated. "I've never done anything like this before," she admitted. "I usually keep to myself." "Well, look at you now." Mrs. Thompson gestured around the busy community center. "Sometimes the best things in life come from stepping outside our comfort zones." She paused, pulling out a final sweater. "My Harold always said that too. He was a tough old military man, but he had the biggest heart." As they talked, Grace found herself sharing more about her life, her worries about her mother, her long hours at the store, her surprise at finding kindness from unexpected sources. Mrs. Thompson listened with genuine interest, offering gentle wisdom and understanding. "You remind me of myself at your age," Mrs. Thompson said, her eyes twinkling. "I was shy too until I joined the hospital auxiliary. That's where I met Harold, you know. He was volunteering in the veterans wing." Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest as she listened to Mrs. Thompson's stories. For the first time in ages, she didn't feel the need to shrink away or hide behind her usual quiet facade. The conversation flowed naturally, like talking to an old friend. "You've got a beautiful spirit," Mrs. Thompson said as she prepared to leave. "Don't let anyone dim that light, dear." Just then, Jackson appeared beside the donation table, his massive frame somehow managing to move quietly. "How's everything going over here?" he asked, his voice gentle despite his intimidating appearance. "Oh, wonderful," Grace replied, surprising herself with her enthusiasm. "Mrs. Thompson was just sharing some amazing stories with me." Jackson smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I knew you'd be perfect for this spot. You've got a way of making people feel comfortable." Grace felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. Looking around at the bustling community center, at the mix of leather-clad bikers and local residents working together, at Mrs. Thompson carefully arranging Harold's clothes, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, of doing something that truly mattered. "Thank you for suggesting this," she said to Jackson, her voice soft but steady. I think I needed this more than I knew." The double doors of the community center swung open, and a familiar figure strode in. Grace's stomach dropped as she watched David West scan the room with calculated precision. His usual business casual attire seemed out of place among the mix of leather jackets and casual wear. A practiced smile stretched across his face, but his eyes remained cold. "Well, well," David called out, his voice carrying across the donation tables. "Quite the gathering we have here." He walked through the center aisle, nodding at people as if he belonged there. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she sorted through the donated clothes. Mrs. Thompson, who was still nearby, noticed the change in Grace's demeanor and moved closer, providing a silent wall of support. David approached the donation table, his shoes clicking against the floor. "Grace," he said, voice dripping with artificial warmth, "I've been looking for you. I wanted to properly apologize for my behavior the other day. I was out of line." The words sounded rehearsed, empty. Grace could feel the stares of nearby volunteers, including several hellsangels who had paused their work to watch the interaction. She managed a small nod, focusing on folding a sweater with precise movements. "It's been a stressful time at the store," David continued, raising his voice slightly. "But seeing all this," he gestured around the room. "It's inspiring. Really shows what our community can do when we work together. Before Grace could respond, David spotted DeMarco across the room, directing some volunteers. His eyes lit up with opportunity. "Ah, there's the man in charge." He straightened his tie and walked purposefully toward the gang leader. Grace watched as David approached DeMarco, extending his hand with practiced confidence. Even from a distance, she could see David's salesman's smile, the one he used when corporate visitors came to the store. "Mr. DeMarco," David's voice carried across the room. "I must say, this is an impressive operation you've got here. You know, with my management experience, I could help streamline things, make it even more efficient." DeMarco crossed his tattooed arms, listening silently as David continued. "For instance, the donation station could use some reorganization, maybe a more structured approach. I noticed some inefficiencies in the current setup." Grace's cheeks burned as she heard David subtly criticize her work. She glanced down at her carefully organized donation records and neat piles of sorted clothing. Mrs. Thompson placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Don't let him get to you, dear," the older woman whispered. "You're doing a wonderful job." David's voice grew more animated as he pitched his ideas to DeMarco. "I could take over the coordination, free up your people for other tasks. After all, I have years of experience managing large operations." Grace forced herself to keep working, methodically recording donations and arranging items. Her hands wanted to shake, but she kept them steady, remembering how the Hells Angels had stood up for her before. Still, David's presence felt like a dark cloud over what had been a bright morning. Several bikers had moved closer to Grace's table, their presence protective rather than threatening. Jackson appeared at her side, casually leaning against the table as he kept an eye on David's interaction with DeMarco. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Grace nodded, managing a small smile. "Yes," she said, surprised to find she meant it. Despite David's attempts to unsettle her, she refused to let him spoil what she'd found here, a sense of purpose and belonging. David circled the donation area like a shark, pointing out what he considered inefficiencies in Grace's system. His dress shoes clicked against the floor as he moved, making Grace more aware of his presence with each step. "You see," he announced loudly, picking up one of Grace's carefully organized folders. "This tracking system is far too basic. We need spreadsheets, proper data entry." He flipped through the pages where Grace had neatly recorded each donation. "This kind of manual recording is outdated." Grace's chest tightened as she watched him dismiss her work. She'd spent hours developing a system that everyone could easily understand and use. The local seniors especially appreciated the simple, clear format. Mrs. Thompson, still sorting clothes nearby, spoke up. "I find Grace's system quite helpful. Some of us older folks aren't too handy with computers, you know." David barely acknowledged the elderly woman, continuing his critique. "And these sorting bins," he gestured at the clearly labeled containers. "They should be arranged by size first, then type. It's just common sense." He began moving boxes around, disrupting the organization Grace had carefully put in place. Several volunteers exchanged concerned glances. The smooth flow of donations that had been running all morning began to falter as David inserted himself into every process, suggesting changes and criticizing procedures. Jackson, who had been helping carry heavy boxes, set down his load and crossed his arms. "Things were working just fine before you showed up," he said, his voice low but firm. "Well, that's a matter of opinion," David replied with a dismissive wave. "I'm simply trying to bring some professional oversight to this operation." The way he said operation made it sound like something questionable. Grace felt her hands trembling as she tried to maintain order at her station. A young mother approached with a bag of children's clothes, but before Grace could help her, David stepped in. "Let me show you how this should be handled," he said, pushing past Grace. "We need to implement a proper intake process. Forms should be filled out in triplicate. The young mother's eyes widened as David launched into a complicated explanation. She clutched her donation bag closer, looking increasingly uncertain. "I'm sorry," she said quietly to Grace. "Maybe I'll come back later." Before she could leave, DeMarco's large frame appeared behind David. The gang leader's presence commanded immediate attention, though he hadn't said a word. He placed a steady hand on David's shoulder, causing the manager to stop mid-sentence. "David," DeMarco said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this event isn't about implementing new systems. It's about community, about helping people feel comfortable giving and receiving help." David's face flushed red. "I'm only trying to help make things more efficient." "Grace has created a system that works," DeMarco continued, his tone gentle but leaving no room for argument. "The volunteers understand it. The donors are comfortable with it. Sometimes, simpler is better." David's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. After a moment, he stepped back, straightening his tie. "Of course," he said stiffly. "Just trying to be helpful." Grace could see the tension in David's jaw as he retreated to the edge of the donation area. He wasn't leaving, just watching, and the weight of his stare made her shoulders tense. Though DeMarco had diffused the immediate situation, Grace could feel the underlying tension building, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. In a quiet corner of the donation area, Grace straightened the already neat piles of children's clothing. The morning rush had slowed to a gentle trickle of donors, giving her a moment to catch her breath. She glanced around the room, taking in the scene before her. Volunteers chatted warmly with donors, their laughter floating through the air. The sorting system she'd created was working smoothly. Even the new volunteers had picked it up quickly. A small smile tugged at her lips as she watched Mrs. Thompson showing another elderly donor exactly where to place their contribution. "Excuse me," a young volunteer called out, holding up a bag of mixed items. "I'm not sure where these should go." Before anyone else could respond, Grace moved toward her. "Here, let me help you with that." Her voice was steady, surprising herself. She guided the volunteer through the sorting process, explaining her system as they worked together. "See how we've color-coded the bins? Blue for clothing, red for toys, and yellow for school supplies. It makes it easier for everyone to find what they need." The volunteer's eyes lit up with understanding. "That makes so much sense. And having the sizes marked clearly on each bin helps too." Grace nodded, warming to the explanation. "Exactly. We want to make it simple for both donors and the families who will receive these items." She paused, then added, "Would you like to help me reorganize the toy section? I've noticed it could use some attention." Together they moved to the toy area, where Grace showed her how to check for missing pieces and sort by age group. As they worked, she noticed other volunteers watching and drifting over to help. "Grace?" An older volunteer approached with a clipboard. "We're running low on storage boxes. Should we start using the extras from the back room?" Without hesitation, Grace responded, "Yes, but let's make sure to leave some for tomorrow's incoming donations. Maybe 4 or 5 boxes for now." The volunteer nodded appreciatively and headed off to fetch them. As she continued working, Grace found herself offering suggestions and answering questions with increasing confidence. When a group of new volunteers arrived, she naturally fell into explaining the donation process, surprised at how easily the words came. "The kids section is over here," she explained, leading them through the space. "We've organized it by age and size to make it easier for families to find what they need. Would any of you like to help sort the new donations coming in?" The volunteers eagerly nodded, and Grace assigned them tasks based on their preferences and abilities. She couldn't help but notice how smoothly everything was running. how natural it felt to guide others. Jackson appeared beside her as she finished directing the new volunteers. His presence was less intimidating now, more like a friendly shadow. He gestured for her to step aside with him. "You know," he said, his voice warm with approval, "I've been watching you today. You've really taken charge here, Grace. The way you're helping everyone, organizing things, making sure everything runs smoothly, it's impressive." Grace felt her cheeks warm at the praise. "I'm just trying to help," she said softly. Jackson shook his head. "No, it's more than that. You're leading. People are looking to you for guidance, and you're giving it to them naturally. You've got a real talent for this." Looking around at the busy room, at the volunteers working together seamlessly, at the system she'd created running like clockwork, Grace felt something shift inside her. Maybe she wasn't just the quiet cashier anymore. Maybe she could be more. The afternoon sun streamed through the community center's windows as donors continued to filter in and out. Grace had just finished helping a mother find winter coats for her children when she heard David's voice cut through the pleasant chatter like a knife. "These people don't belong here." David stood in the middle of the room, his face red with anger. He pointed accusingly at a group of Hell's Angels who were helping elderly donors carry heavy boxes. "They're criminals, troublemakers. How can anyone trust them with charity work?" The room fell silent. Grace's heart pounded as she watched several families draw their children closer, uncertainty clouding their faces. The peaceful atmosphere they'd worked so hard to create was shattering around them. David's voice grew louder, more theatrical. "I've seen what these thugs are capable of. They threatened me at my own store." He turned to address the crowd directly. "Is this really who you want handling donations for your children?" A murmur of concern rippled through the room. Some donors clutched their bags closer, while others began edging toward the exit. Grace watched helplessly as the morning's progress started to unravel. "They're dangerous," David continued, his voice echoing off the walls. "Just look at them. Tattoos, leather, motorcycles. They're trying to fool you all with this charity act, but I know better." DeMarco stood quietly near the sorting area, his massive frame somehow containing a dignity that David's theatrical display lacked. The other angels remained at their posts, faces stern but controlled, refusing to give David the reaction he wanted. "Sir," one of the regular volunteers spoke up, "they've been nothing but helpful." "That's how they trick you," David cut her off. "They pretend to be good citizens, but they're just waiting for their chance to—" "That's enough." DeMarco's deep voice carried across the room without shouting. He took a step forward, and despite his calm demeanor, David flinched. "We're here to help children in need, nothing more." But David wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police. They shouldn't be allowed near children's donations." His hands shook as he fumbled with the device. "Everyone needs to leave now. It's not safe." More whispers spread through the crowd. A few people began gathering their things, looking uncertainly between David and the angels. Grace saw the doubt in their eyes, the hesitation in their movements. All their hard work, all the trust they'd built, was being poisoned by David's words. The Hell's Angels stood their ground, neither advancing nor retreating. They exchanged glances with each other, but maintained their positions at their assigned stations. Their restraint was obvious, but David's accusations hung heavy in the air. Grace watched as a young mother pulled her donation bag back from the collection bin, apologizing softly to the volunteer. Another family ushered their children toward the door, throwing nervous glances over their shoulders. DeMarco remained steady, his expression neutral, but his eyes alert. The other angels followed his lead, staying calm despite the growing tension. But Grace could see the strain in their faces, the hurt beneath their stoic expressions as people began to view them with suspicion. The atmosphere in the room had transformed completely. Where there had been warmth and community, now there was uncertainty and fear. The easy flow of donations had stopped, replaced by awkward pauses and sidelong glances. Grace stood frozen behind her booth, her stomach churning as she watched David continue his tirade. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. She looked around at the faces of people she'd worked with all morning, now unsure and afraid, and wondered if everything they'd built was about to come crashing down. Grace took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she stepped out from behind the donation booth. The fear that usually kept her quiet was still there, but something stronger was pushing her forward. A need to protect what they'd built here today. "David," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her racing heart, "you need to leave." David spun around, his eyes wide with surprise at her intervention. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Grace moved to stand between him and the crowd. "This event isn't about you. It's about helping children who need winter clothes and school supplies." The room fell silent. Even the soft rustling of donation bags stopped as everyone watched the scene unfold. Grace felt the weight of their stares but kept her focus on David. "These people," she gestured to the Hells Angels, "have spent weeks organizing this event. They've given their time, their energy, and their hearts to help others." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I've watched them carry heavy boxes for elderly donors, play with children, and treat everyone with respect." David's face reddened. "You don't understand what you're talking about, Grace. These men are—" "These men," Grace cut him off, surprising herself with her firmness, "are doing more for this community right now than your accusations ever will." She took another step forward. "I've worked with them all morning. They're here because they care." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some of the donors who had been heading for the exit paused, turning back to watch. "If anyone is causing trouble here, it's you," Grace continued, her voice remaining calm but firm. "You're trying to ruin something good because you can't stand not being in control." David's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked around the room, perhaps hoping to find support, but met only disapproving stares. "I won't ask again," Grace said, standing straighter. "Please leave. Now." David's face twisted with anger. "You'll regret this," he spat out. "All of you will." He jabbed a finger toward Grace. "You're nothing but a timid little cashier who got lucky with some gang protection. Don't think this makes you special." But his words didn't have the impact he'd hoped for. Instead of shrinking back, Grace remained steady, her expression unchanged. "Goodbye, David." With a final glare, David stormed toward the exit, muttering under his breath. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through the quiet room. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone started clapping. Others joined in, and soon the room filled with applause. Grace felt her cheeks flush as she turned back to her booth, catching DeMarco's eye as she did. The big man's face broke into a proud smile, and he gave her a slight nod of approval. The tension in the room began to dissolve, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and community. The event resumed its natural flow, with donors returning to their tasks and volunteers continuing their work. Grace noticed that some of the families who had been ready to leave were now coming back, offering apologetic smiles as they handed over their donations. She returned to her position behind the donation booth, her hands still shaking slightly, but her heart lighter. For the first time in her life, she had stood her ground. And it felt right. The door had barely stopped rattling from David's dramatic exit when Jackson appeared at Grace's side, gently touching her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine, concern. Grace nodded, surprised to find that she actually meant it. I am. She looked around at the temporarily stalled event. Donors and volunteers stood in small clusters, whispering and casting uncertain glances around the room. Let's get back to work, she said, louder this time. These donations won't sort themselves. Her words seemed to break the spell. The Hells Angels immediately sprang into action, returning to their stations with renewed energy. DeMarco began directing traffic at the entrance, his imposing figure now wearing a welcoming smile that put nervous donors at ease. Grace returned to the donation booth, where a line had started to form. An elderly woman stepped forward, arms laden with carefully folded children's clothes. That took real courage, dear, she said, placing the bundle on the table. I just did what needed to be done, Grace replied, carefully sorting the items into appropriate bins. She felt a warmth spread through her chest as she worked, a feeling of belonging she'd never experienced before. Throughout the afternoon, the Hells Angels kept checking in on her. They brought her water, helped sort particularly large donations, and made sure she took breaks when needed. It wasn't just protection anymore. It was genuine care and respect. "Hey, Grace!" called out one of the younger members, Tommy, as he wheeled in another cart of donations. "We're running out of space in the storage room. Got any ideas?" Without hesitation, Grace surveyed the room. "Let's move these tables against the wall," she suggested, pointing to some empty furniture. "We can stack the boxes higher there, and it'll create more walking space too." The bikers nodded in approval and immediately began implementing her suggestion. Grace watched in amazement as they worked together seamlessly, following her directions without question. Even more surprising was how natural it felt to give those directions. As the afternoon wore on, the stream of donations seemed endless. Parents brought in outgrown clothes, local businesses delivered supplies, and community members arrived with everything from winter coats to school backpacks. Each time the door opened, Grace felt a surge of joy at seeing another person ready to help. Jackson appeared again, this time with a clipboard. "Grace, you're not going to believe this," he said, grinning broadly. "We've already doubled last year's donations, and there's still an hour to go." Grace's eyes widened as she looked at the numbers. All around her, boxes were stacked nearly to the ceiling, filled with items that would help countless children. The sight brought tears to her eyes. Happy tears this time. "You did this," DeMarco said, appearing beside her. His voice was gruff but warm. "People stayed because of you. They saw someone standing up for what's right, and it made them want to be part of it." Grace felt her cheeks flush at the praise, but she didn't look away. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and smiled. "We all did this," she corrected him, gesturing to the room full of bikers and volunteers working together. "Everyone here made it happen." Looking around at the bustling room, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Real, genuine pride. Not just in the success of the event, but in herself. She had found her voice today, and with it, she'd found a family she never expected. The last donor had left, and the Hells Angels were busy loading the final boxes into their trucks. Grace found a quiet corner and sank into a folding chair, her feet aching from hours of standing but her heart surprisingly light. The empty venue still hummed with the echoes of the day's activities. She closed her eyes, remembering how just this morning she'd been terrified of even showing up. The familiar knot of anxiety that usually sat in her stomach had been replaced by something warmer, more solid. Pride, maybe? Or confidence? Whatever it was, it felt right. Her mind wandered back to the convenience store, to all those quiet shifts where she'd tried her best to blend into the background. She thought about David's cruel grip on her arm, how helpless she'd felt in that moment. The memory no longer made her shrink. Instead, it reminded her of how far she'd come. Today, she'd done more than just exist. She'd made a difference. She'd organized donations, directed volunteers, and even stood up to David. The shy cashier, who used to apologize for asking customers to repeat their orders, had found her voice. Grace opened her eyes and looked around the room. Empty boxes were stacked neatly against one wall, waiting to be broken down. A forgotten name tag lay on the floor, and scattered papers dotted a few tables. But beyond the mess, she saw something else. The ghost of what had happened here. She saw herself directing traffic when the donation area got crowded, remembered the proud nod DeMarco had given her when she'd solved a scheduling conflict. "Penny for your thoughts?" Grace turned to find Jackson standing nearby, his massive frame somehow less intimidating than it had been this morning. He was holding 2 paper cups of coffee, one extended toward her. "Thank you," she said, accepting the cup gratefully. The warmth seeped into her tired hands. "Someday, huh?" Jackson settled into a chair next to her, which creaked under his weight. Grace nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. "I never thought I could do something like this," she admitted. "Standing up to David, running the donation station, it all seemed impossible this morning." "But you did it anyway," Jackson pointed out. "That's what counts." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both watching as the last few bikers carried boxes out to the waiting trucks. Grace could hear their good-natured banter floating back into the room. "You know," Jackson said finally, setting his empty cup aside, "we do these kinds of events pretty regularly. Food drives, toy collections, fundraisers for local families in need." He turned to look at her directly. "We could use someone like you." Grace's heart skipped a beat. Someone like me? Someone who can organize, who cares about people, who isn't afraid to stand up for what's right. He smiled. "Plus, you've already got the seal of approval from DeMarco, and that's not easy to get." Grace wrapped her hands tighter around her coffee cup, feeling the warmth of possibility spreading through her chest. The old Grace would have immediately said no, would have retreated back to her safe, quiet life at the store. But she wasn't that person anymore. Still, she hesitated. I don't know anything about organizing charity events." "You did pretty well today," Jackson pointed out. "And we'd be there to help. What do you say?" The convenience store's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Grace straightened her name tag. It had been 3 days since the charity event, and something felt different. The aisles seemed brighter somehow, the routine tasks less mundane. Even the morning rush of caffeine-seeking customers didn't overwhelm her like it used to. "Excuse me." An elderly woman approached the counter, holding a crumpled coupon. "I can't quite read the expiration date on this." The old Grace would have simply taken the coupon and checked it herself, avoiding eye contact. Instead, she smiled warmly and walked around the counter to stand beside the customer. "Let me help you with that," Grace said, gently taking the coupon. "These small prints can be tricky sometimes. Would you like me to show you where to find the date on all our coupons? It might help for next time." The woman's face lit up. "Oh, would you? That's so kind of you, dear." As Grace explained, she noticed Jenny, the new cashier, watching from the second register. The teenager had started just yesterday, and Grace had taken it upon herself to show her the ropes. It wasn't part of her job description, but something about helping others felt right now. "Jenny," Grace called out after the elderly woman left, "would you like to learn how to process coupons? It comes up a lot during the morning shift." Jenny nodded eagerly and joined Grace at the main register. As Grace demonstrated the process, she found herself speaking with a confidence she'd never known she possessed. Her voice was steady, her instructions clear, and she even managed to throw in a few helpful tips she'd learned over the years. "You're really good at this," Jenny said, practicing what Grace had shown her. "How long have you been working here?" 2 years, Grace replied, then added with a small laugh. "Though it feels like I've learned more in the past few days than in all that time combined." The morning continued, and Grace found herself moving through the store with a new sense of purpose. She helped customers find items, offered suggestions when asked, and even solved a pricing dispute without having to call for a manager. Each small interaction built upon the last, reinforcing the strength she'd discovered at the charity event. Around noon, the automatic doors slid open, and David walked in. He looked different somehow. Smaller, less threatening. His usual crisp shirt was slightly wrinkled, and his steps lacked their usual authority. Grace felt her spine straighten, but the fear that used to accompany his presence was noticeably absent. "Grace," he said, approaching the counter with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Do you have a moment?" She glanced at Jenny, who nodded to indicate she could handle the register alone. Grace led David to the side of the counter, maintaining a professional distance. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," David began, his voice unusually quiet. "What I did, how I treated you, it was completely unacceptable. I was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." Grace studied his face, noting the genuine remorse in his eyes. The words she'd once desperately wanted to hear now felt strangely hollow, not because they weren't sincere, but because she realized she no longer needed them. "I appreciate your apology, David," she replied, her voice steady and clear. The tremor that used to accompany her interactions with him was gone. She stood tall, meeting his gaze directly, no longer the timid cashier who would shrink from confrontation. David shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze, clearly thrown by this new version of Grace. He opened his mouth as if to say more, then closed it again, seeming to realize that the power dynamic between them had fundamentally changed. The afternoon sun streamed through the convenience store windows, casting long shadows across the aisles. Grace had just finished restocking the candy section when the bell above the door chimed. A man in an expensive suit stormed in, his face red with anger, clutching a receipt in his fist. "Who's in charge here?" he demanded, marching straight to the counter where Grace stood. The paper crinkled as he slammed it down. "I was overcharged yesterday, twice." Grace picked up the receipt, examining it carefully. Her hands didn't shake like they used to when confronted by angry customers. She noticed Jenny, the new cashier, watching nervously from the coffee station. "Sir, I'd be happy to help you with this," Grace said, keeping her voice steady and professional. "Could you show me which items you believe were overcharged?" The man jabbed his finger at the receipt, nearly poking a hole through it. "These energy drinks. The sign said 2 for $5, but I was charged full price. It's highway robbery." Grace remembered the promotion had ended 3 days ago. The old Grace would have apologized immediately, maybe even offered a refund just to avoid confrontation. But now, she took a deep breath and stood her ground. "I understand your frustration," she said, meeting his gaze. "That promotion ended on Monday. The new signs were put up first thing Tuesday morning." She gestured to the current display, where the regular prices were clearly marked. "Are you calling me a liar?" The man's voice rose, drawing attention from other customers. "I know what I saw. I want to speak to your manager right now." Grace felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she thought of DeMarco's steady presence, of how he handled difficult situations with calm authority. She straightened her shoulders and spoke with quiet confidence. "Sir, I respect that you are upset, but raising your voice won't solve anything. I've been working here for 2 years, and I personally changed those signs on Monday evening. I'd be happy to show you our current promotions, or if you'd prefer, I can print out our pricing history to verify the dates." The man blinked, clearly thrown off by her composed response. He'd probably expected her to crumble under his anger, but the Grace who would have done that was gone. "Look," she continued, her voice softening but remaining firm, "I understand it's frustrating when you expect one price and get charged another. If you'd like, I can add you to our email list for promotional updates, so you'll know exactly when our sales begin and end." A few customers in line nodded approvingly. The man's face slowly lost its angry flush as he realized he wasn't going to win this battle, at least not through intimidation. I suppose I might have been mistaken about the date," he muttered, stuffing the receipt into his pocket. "But you should make those signs bigger, more visible." Grace nodded respectfully. "That's actually good feedback. I'll bring it up at our next staff meeting. Would you like me to show you our current promotions? We have some great deals on similar items this week." The tension in the air dissipated as the man's posture relaxed. He glanced at the promotional aisle Grace indicated, then back at her name tag. "No, that's all right," he said, his tone notably more subdued. "Thank you for explaining, Grace." As he turned to leave, Grace felt a warm glow of satisfaction spread through her chest. She'd handled the situation with professionalism and dignity, without backing down or losing her cool. Grace sat in her car after her shift, the afternoon sun warming the dashboard. Her phone buzzed, and she smiled when she saw DeMarco's name on the screen. Since the charity event, he'd been checking in regularly, like a protective uncle keeping tabs on his favorite niece. "Hey there, boss," she answered, using the nickname everyone called him. "Grace," his deep voice rumbled through the speaker. "Heard you handled quite a situation at the store today." She leaned back in her seat. "News travels fast, huh?" "Jenny called Jackson, said she was impressed by how you dealt with that angry customer." There was a note of pride in his voice that made Grace's chest warm. "I just did what needed to be done," Grace said, fiddling with her car keys. "It wasn't anything special." "That's where you're wrong," DeMarcos replied. The old Grace would have crumbled. This new Grace? She stood her ground. That's something special. Grace thought about how different she felt these days. The charity event had awakened something in her, a desire to do more, to be more. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about getting more involved in the community. The charity event showed me how much good we can do when we work together." "That so?" She could hear the smile in DeMarco's voice. "What kind of involvement were you thinking about?" "Well, there's this senior center near my mom's place. They're always looking for volunteers." Grace paused, gathering her courage. "And I thought maybe we could organize something there, like what we did with the charity event." The line went quiet for a moment. Grace held her breath, worried she'd overstepped. "You know what I see?" DeMarco finally spoke. "I see someone who's finally starting to believe in herself. Someone who's ready to step up and make a difference." Grace felt her eyes getting misty. I want to help people, like you and the guys helped me." "And that's exactly why I've been wanting to talk to you," DeMarco said. "You've got something special, Grace. A way with people. They trust you. Follow your lead naturally. I saw it at the charity event." "I don't know about that," Grace protested, though her heart lifted at his words. "I do know," DeMarco's voice was firm, "which is why I want to mentor you, help you develop those leadership skills you've shown, teach you what I know about organizing events, managing people, making things happen in the community." Grace sat up straighter, her hand gripping the phone tighter. "You'd do that? Really?" "Wouldn't offer if I didn't mean it," he chuckled. "What do you say? Ready to learn from an old biker who's been around the block a few times?" Grace thought about how far she'd come since that night when DeMarco and his gang had stepped in to protect her. She thought about the confidence she'd found, the strength she didn't know she had. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'd like that very much." "Good," DeMarco replied. "We'll start next week. First lesson, planning that senior center event you mentioned." Grace grinned, already feeling excited about the possibilities ahead. The shy cashier, who used to hide from the world, was gone, replaced by someone who was ready to make her mark on the community. Grace stood in the senior center's recreation room, clipboard in hand, directing volunteers where to set up tables and decorations. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting warm light on the wooden floors. Several Hells Angels members, wearing their leather vests over clean white t-shirts, carefully arranged chairs while chatting with the elderly residents. "The bake sale tables should go near the entrance," Grace called out to Jackson, who was helping another volunteer with a folding table. "We want people to smell those cookies as soon as they walk in." DeMarco watched from the doorway, arms crossed, and a slight smile on his face. Over the past few weeks, he'd guided Grace through the planning process, but today she was running the show. The fundraiser was her baby, a combination bake sale, craft fair, and music event to raise money for new medical equipment at the senior center. "Looking good in here," DeMarco said, approaching Grace. "You've got everything under control?" Grace nodded, checking items off her list. "The local bakery's delivering more treats in an hour. The high school jazz band will set up by the window, and Mrs. Peterson's quilting group is bringing their handmade items to sell." "And you've got the raffle prizes secured?" "All set," Grace replied confidently. "The community really stepped up. We've got restaurant gift cards, spa packages, and even that signed football from the state team." A small group of seniors entered the room, and Grace immediately went to greet them. These were the regular residents she'd gotten to know over the past few weeks while planning the event. They'd taken to her immediately, charmed by her gentle manner and genuine interest in their stories. "Martha, how are you feeling today?" Grace hugged a white-haired woman who reminded her of her mother. "Are you ready to help with the bake sale?" "Wouldn't miss it for the world, dear." Martha patted Grace's arm. "My sugar cookies are cooling at home. My grandson's bringing them over soon." As the morning progressed, the senior center transformed into a bustling marketplace. The smell of fresh baked goods filled the air, and the sound of jazz music created a festive atmosphere. Grace moved through the crowd, solving problems before they became issues, making sure everyone had what they needed. "Remember when you first started planning this?" DeMarco appeared at her side, handing her a cup of coffee. "You were worried nobody would show up." Grace accepted the coffee gratefully. "I still can't believe how many people came to help. Even David from the store donated some gift cards." "That's because you've shown them what you can do," DeMarco said. "They trust you now. They know when Grace Mitchell's organizing something, it's going to be worth their time." Grace watched as families browsed the craft tables, children played games with the seniors, and people dropped generous donations into the collection boxes. The Hells Angels mingled with the crowd, their tough appearance softened by their gentle interactions with the elderly residents. "You know," Grace said, "I used to think I was invisible, just the quiet girl at the register who nobody really noticed." She paused, taking in the scene before her. "But now you're the woman who makes things happen," DeMarco finished for her. "The one who brings people together." A volunteer waved Grace over to help resolve a question about the raffle tickets. As she walked away, she caught her reflection in one of the windows. The person looking back at her wasn't the timid cashier anymore, but someone who stood tall, someone who knew her worth, someone who had found her place in the community. The fundraiser hummed with activity around her, a testament to what she could accomplish when she believed in herself. Grace smiled, ready to tackle whatever challenge came next. The community center buzzed with activity as volunteers scurried around, setting up tables and hanging decorations for the Children's Reading Program fundraiser. Grace adjusted her name tag, which now read Lead Organizer beneath her name. The title still felt new, like a jacket that hadn't quite broken in yet. "Everything's set up in the West Wing," Jackson reported, his tattooed arms full of children's books. "The storytelling corner looks amazing with those cloud decorations you designed." Grace checked her clipboard and nodded. "Thanks, Jackson. Could you make sure the snack station is stocked? We're expecting at least 50 kids from the elementary school." As Jackson headed off, Grace felt a familiar presence behind her. DeMarco stood there, watching her work with obvious pride. "Look at you," he said, his deep voice warm with approval. "Running this place like you've been doing it for years." Grace smiled, though her stomach was doing flip-flops. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "This is the first time I'm actually in charge of everything. What if something goes wrong?" "Then you'll handle it," DeMarco said simply. "Just like you've handled everything else that's come your way." Around them, other Hells Angels members were helping with final preparations. Some wore colorful, reading-themed pins on their leather vests, creating an endearing contrast that made Grace's heart swell. These tough-looking men had become like family to her, supporting her every step of the way. "Ms. Mitchell?" A young volunteer approached with a concerned look. "The face painter called in sick. She's not coming." A few months ago, this kind of last-minute crisis would have sent Grace into a panic. Now she took a deep breath and thought quickly. "Sarah at the craft store does face painting at the farmer's market. Give her a call. She owes me a favor for helping with her Christmas toy drive." The volunteer hurried off, and DeMarco chuckled. "See? Problem solved." Grace moved through the space, checking details and coordinating with volunteers. She'd arranged the room in stations, reading corners with comfortable beanbags, craft tables where kids could make their own bookmarks, and a small stage where local authors would give readings. Parents began arriving with their children, and Grace felt her nervousness transform into excitement. A little girl tugged at her sleeve, asking where to find the dragon stories. Grace knelt down to her level and pointed her toward a corner where one of the Hells Angels, covered in tattoos but wearing reading glasses, was organizing a stack of fantasy books. "Remember when you couldn't even look people in the eye?" Jackson said, passing by with another box of supplies. "Now look at you, running the show." Grace watched as the community center filled with families. Everything was flowing smoothly, just as she'd planned. The storytelling sessions were starting on schedule, children were engaged in activities, and parents were dropping donations into the collection boxes. A group of teachers from the elementary school arrived, and Grace greeted them confidently. These were the same people who used to intimidate her when she'd drop off her mother's paperwork at the school office. Now she was working alongside them, coordinating programs to help their students. From across the room, she caught DeMarco's eye. He gave her a subtle nod, one that said he'd known all along what she was capable of. Grace stood a little straighter, feeling the mantle of leadership settle more comfortably on her shoulders. She wasn't just the shy cashier anymore. She was making a real difference in her community, and it felt right. Grace pushed open the door to her mother's room at Sunny Meadows Care Home, carrying a small photo album under her arm. The afternoon sun streamed through lace curtains, casting gentle shadows across her mother's familiar face. Martha Mitchell sat in her favorite armchair, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, her silver hair neatly combed. "Hi, Mom," Grace said softly, pulling up a chair beside her. "I brought something to show you." Martha's eyes brightened with recognition. One of her good days, Grace realized with relief. Those moments were becoming rarer, but they were all the more precious for it. "Grace, sweetheart," Martha smiled, reaching out to touch her daughter's hand. "You look different today. Happier." Grace opened the photo album across their laps. "I am happier, Mom. Remember how I told you about the charity events I've been helping with?" She pointed to a photograph of herself surrounded by Hell's Angels members, all of them grinning as they stood in front of tables piled with donated books. "Oh my," Martha said, adjusting her glasses. "Are these the motorcycle fellows you mentioned?" Grace nodded, turning the page to show more pictures. "They've helped me so much, Mom. Remember how scared I used to be? How I'd barely speak up at the store?" She touched a photo of herself at the microphone during the last fundraiser. "Look at me now, giving speeches, organizing events." Martha's fingers traced the outline of Grace's face in the photograph. "You remind me of your father," she said softly. "He always knew you had it in you to do great things." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I wish he could see me now." "He can, sweetheart," Martha said with surprising clarity. "He always could." They went through more photos together. Images of Grace working with children at reading events, coordinating volunteer activities, standing proudly with DeMarco and the other Hell's Angels as they presented donation checks to local charities. "Tell me about this one." Martha pointed to a picture of Grace laughing with a group of volunteers. "That was when we organized the summer reading program," Grace explained. "We helped over 50 kids improve their reading skills. Some of them had never owned their own books before." Martha squeezed her daughter's hand. "You've found your calling, haven't you?" Grace paused, letting the truth of those words sink in. She thought about how far she'd come from the timid cashier who used to hide behind her register. The change wasn't just in what she did, it was in who she'd become. "I have," she admitted. "But it's more than that, Mom. I found myself." She closed the photo album and looked at her mother. "All those years I was so focused on just getting by, on being invisible. I never knew who I really was or what I could do." Martha's eyes were clear and knowing. "And now?" "Now I know that being strong doesn't mean being perfect. It means being brave enough to try, to speak up, to help others." Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm not just surviving anymore, Mom. I'm living." Her mother reached up to wipe away a tear from Grace's cheek, just as she had done when Grace was a little girl. For a moment, the roles of caregiver and cared for blurred, and they were simply mother and daughter, sharing a profound moment of understanding. "My beautiful girl," Martha whispered. "You've always been extraordinary. You just needed to believe it yourself." Grace heard the whispers before she saw them. Small groups of customers huddled near the aisles, their eyes darting away when she looked in their direction. She caught fragments of their conversations, something about her being in league with criminals and probably stealing from the store. At first she tried to ignore it, but then Sarah, one of the newer cashiers, approached her with worry in her eyes. "Grace, I think you should know," Sarah whispered, glancing around nervously. "David's been telling everyone that you're working with the Hell's Angels to launder money through the charity events. He's even saying you've been taking cash from the register." Grace felt her chest tighten, but it wasn't from fear. It was from anger. She'd worked too hard, come too far to let David tear down everything she'd built. Through the store's front windows, she could see him in the parking lot, talking to a group of regular customers, his hands moving animatedly as he spun his lies. Taking a deep breath, Grace straightened her name tag and walked outside. The morning sun was warm on her face as she approached the group. David's voice cut off mid-sentence when he saw her coming. "Is there something you'd like to say to me directly, David?" Grace's voice carried across the parking lot, clear and strong. The customers shifted uncomfortably, but she kept her eyes fixed on David. He tried to maintain his composure, but she could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Just having a conversation," he said, attempting to sound casual. "About how I'm stealing from the store? Or about how the charity events are just a front?" Grace moved closer, her steps measured and confident. "Why don't you tell them about how you tried to assault me in the store bathroom? Or how you've been trying to sabotage every community event I've helped organize?" David's face reddened. "You're twisting things around. Everyone knows what kind of people you're involved with now." "Yes, they do," Grace agreed, her voice steady. "They know I work with a group of people who've raised thousands of dollars for children's education, who've helped rebuild homes for the elderly, and who stepped in when no one else would to protect someone in need." The customers were watching intently now, some nodding in agreement. They'd seen the positive changes in the community, had attended the events Grace had organized. "You're just trying to save face," David sputtered, but his voice had lost its edge. "No, David. I'm done letting you try to control the narrative." Grace turned to address the small crowd. "Anyone who wants to know the truth about our charity work is welcome to attend our next event. We keep detailed records of every dollar raised and spent. Unlike some people, we have nothing to hide." David took a step back, his authority crumbling in the face of Grace's calm confidence. She could see it in his eyes, the realization that he no longer had any power over her. "This is your last warning," Grace said quietly, but firmly. "Stop spreading lies about me, or I'll be forced to take this to the corporate office. I have plenty of witnesses to your behavior." Without another word, David turned and walked to his car. As he drove away, Grace noticed her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline. She'd stood her ground, defended herself and her work without raising her voice or losing her composure. The small group of customers began to disperse, many of them offering supportive smiles or gentle pats on her shoulder as they passed. Sarah was waiting by the store entrance, beaming with admiration. "That was incredible," Sarah whispered, as Grace walked back inside. Grace straightened her shoulders and smiled. David could no longer hurt her, not with threats, not with lies, not with anything. She was stronger now, and they both knew it. The morning sun streamed through the curtains of Grace's mother's room, casting a warm glow across the familiar space. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, helping her mother button up her favorite cardigan. Though her mother's memory came and went like autumn leaves in the wind, today was one of her better days. "You look different," her mother said, reaching up to touch Grace's cheek. "There's a light in your eyes I haven't seen before." Grace smiled, covering her mother's hand with her own. "I feel different, Mom. Remember I told you about the charity events? Well, we've raised enough money to start a new after-school program for kids who need extra help." Her mother's eyes sparkled with recognition. "With those motorcycle friends of yours?" "The Hellsangels," Grace confirmed, adjusting her mother's collar. "They've become like family to me. DeMarco especially. He believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Together they moved to the kitchen where Grace had prepared breakfast. As she watched her mother enjoy the meal, Grace felt a surge of gratitude. Her increased confidence hadn't just changed her work life. It had transformed her relationship with her mother, too. She was more patient now, more understanding of the challenges they both faced. Later that afternoon, Grace arrived at the community center where volunteers were setting up for their latest event. The space buzzed with activity. Hell's Angels members arranging chairs, local volunteers hanging decorations, and children darting between tables with excitement. "There's our fearless leader," Jackson called out, his tattooed arms full of craft supplies. Grace couldn't help but laugh at how natural it felt now, directing people and making decisions. She remembered how she used to shrink away from any attention, how she'd hide behind her cash register and wish to be invisible. DeMarco appeared beside her, his imposing figure now a source of comfort rather than intimidation. "The mayor's office called," he said, his voice carrying its usual calm authority. "They want to partner with us for the summer youth program." Grace nodded, already mentally organizing the possibilities. "We could use their resources to expand the tutoring sessions," she said thoughtfully. "Maybe even start that mentorship program we've been discussing." She caught her reflection in one of the windows, shoulders back, head high, a natural smile on her face. The timid cashier who used to flinch at her own shadow was gone, replaced by someone who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to show it. The community center filled with families as the event began. Grace moved through the crowd with ease, greeting people by name, solving minor crises before they could become major ones, and making sure everyone felt welcome. She watched as tough-looking bikers helped children with art projects, their gentle patience breaking down stereotypes with every kind word and encouraging smile. Standing at the front of the room, Grace surveyed the scene with pride. DeMarco joined her, his presence steady and reassuring as always. The noise of happy chatter and children's laughter filled the air, a testament to what they'd built together. "You've come a long way," DeMarco said quietly, watching as more families streamed through the doors. Grace thought about her journey, from the frightened woman in the convenience store to someone who could organize events like this, someone who could make a real difference in her community. She thought about all the challenges she'd faced and overcome, and all the ones still to come. She smiled, feeling the strength of her newfound confidence. "We all have," she replied, ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead. "I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story, and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day."